You have 5 seconds to leave this property, or I'm calling the HOA security. Jolene snapped at me, holding up her phone with trembling hands. I calmly leaned back in my chair, still holding my lemonade, and asked, "Would you like to speak to the Secret Service agent in the car first, or after you hang up?" She blinked. Then the black SUV door opened, and her world flipped. It had started like any other lazy Sunday, the kind of day when you grab an old book, your favorite cold drink, and park yourself in the shade of a tree you planted 15 years ago. I was minding my own business in my backyard. Emphasis on my backyard. This was no shared space, fully fenced, fully deeded, and fully separate from the chaos that occasionally festered in the HOA-run parts of the neighborhood. I wasn't even part of the HOA. My property, built before the HOA was ever formed, sat like a peaceful island just outside their overreaching jurisdiction. But that didn't stop Jolene. Jolene wasn't even her real name. Her legal name was something like Jolene Madison Whitaker, but she wore the title Karen like a badge of honor. She had the pastel tracksuit, the oversized sunglasses, the platinum pixie cut, and the shrill, self-important voice that carried across fences like a nuclear siren. And today, she decided I was the villain of the week. I'd seen her stomping around lately with a clipboard and what looked like a homemade badge that read, HOA Vice Chair Enforcer. I thought it was a costume, a joke. Apparently not, because that afternoon, while I was reading under the tree with my lemonade sweating beside me, Jolene strutted up to the property line and just stood there. She didn't say hello. She didn't even start with a question. She just looked at me like I was a raccoon digging through her trash and said, "You're not supposed to be here." I laughed at first. I actually looked around, thinking maybe she was talking to someone else. But no, she was glaring at me like I had personally defiled her flower bed. I asked what she meant, and she puffed herself up and said, "This yard belongs to the HOA, and you're not allowed here unless you're a member." I put my book down, raised my eyebrows, and said, "Ma'am, I live here." She snorted, "No, you don't. This house belongs to a federal consultant. We've seen men in suits coming and going. You're probably a squatter or one of those fake security types. Now, here's the thing. I am a federal consultant, and yes, I have a rotating detail of men in suits. Not because I'm in danger, but because the nature of my work requires me to be well watched. Think of it like a traveling diplomat with access to confidential projects. It's not flashy work, and most days are boring briefings, but it pays well and sometimes comes with black SUVs and people wearing earpieces. Apparently, Jolene had been watching, but she had reached all the wrong conclusions. Before I could say anything else, she pulled out her phone and said she was calling the neighborhood patrol. I asked, "Is that an actual thing?" She scowled and replied, "Yes, and they have authority here, unlike you." That's when I noticed Phil, shirtless, tanned to the point of looking like worn leather, with wraparound sunglasses and cargo shorts, rolling up in a golf cart. He had a megaphone. Yes, a literal megaphone. And he announced, "Sir, you are trespassing on HOA-monitored property. You need to vacate immediately." I honestly thought it was a prank. I looked around for hidden cameras. This couldn't be real. I even smiled a bit, waiting for the punchline. But Jolene started filming me. Phil started recording, too. And the neighbors began to peek through their blinds like it was reality TV. I sighed and reached into my back pocket. No, not for a weapon, for my phone. I calmly dialed Agent Sanchez. "Sir," he answered quickly. "I think you may want to drive around back," I said. "We've got an aggressive HOA situation." "Understood," he replied. That was it. No panic, just protocol. Jolene saw me on the phone and started screaming about how I was pretending to be a secret agent and that I was clearly a threat to the neighborhood. She yelled for someone to get the kids inside. Phil shouted, "We got a hostile," through his megaphone. I could barely keep a straight face. A few minutes later, the unmistakable hum of a high-end SUV approached. Black, armored, government plates. It pulled up right outside my fence, and two large men stepped out. Suits, sunglasses, calm as ice. One of them nodded at me and then turned to Jolene. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the property," he said. Jolene blinked, mouth open. Phil dropped his megaphone. Agent Sanchez joined us in the yard, walked past me, and asked, "Everything okay, sir?" I said, "Jolene here seems to think I don't live here." Agent Sanchez looked at her deadpan. "Ma'am, this gentleman is a federally protected consultant. You have just interfered with a secure location." Jolene's face went from confident to confused to absolutely livid. She screamed, "This is fake. You guys are all actors. I saw a video about this on YouTube." Phil was already backing away, his golf cart slowly reversing like he'd seen a ghost. Agent Sanchez held up his badge. Jolene swatted at it like it was a mosquito. That's not real. I know my rights. Agent Sanchez tapped his earpiece and said, "We have a civilian refusing to comply with verbal commands. Requesting documentation team." Jolene's jaw dropped. Documentation team? A second SUV rolled up, this one clearly marked Homeland Security. The logo alone made Phil trip over his own feet trying to flee. Jolene stood frozen, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "You're all going to regret this," she shrieked. "I'm calling the news." "Ma'am," Agent Sanchez said, calmly stepping forward, "you're already live streaming. That should suffice." And with that, Jolene realized she'd made the biggest mistake of her nosy little life. But the show was far from over because the HOA wasn't done, and neither was I. Jolene didn't just back off. No, that would have been far too reasonable. Instead, she doubled down with the same stubborn energy that toddlers use when insisting they didn't eat the cookies while covered in crumbs. The sight of not one, but two black SUVs and suited agents would have made most people pause, maybe even issue a sheepish apology. But Jolene looked at the agents like they were part of a community theater production she hadn't approved, still convinced this was some elaborate prank orchestrated to undermine her non-existent authority. She marched straight up to Agent Sanchez, who stood like a statue behind his sunglasses, and demanded to see his credentials again. When he obliged, holding up the same official federal badge he had displayed minutes earlier, she scoffed and said, "Please, I could buy that off Etsy. You can't just flash shiny things and expect people to roll over." Agent Sanchez, never one to escalate, responded with silence and a slow, practiced blink that somehow made her more furious. Behind Jolene, Phil was clearly having second thoughts. He leaned against his golf cart with his arms folded, his eyes darting toward the gate as if weighing the risk of making a break for it versus pretending to have a heart attack to avoid accountability. Jolene didn't notice. She was too busy barking orders and waving her phone around like it was a magic wand that would turn law enforcement into dust. "You're impersonating government officials," she hissed. "And you're on HOA property without permission." Agent Sanchez gave a quick nod to his partner, Agent Diaz, who had just finished inspecting the perimeter. Agent Diaz approached and spoke in a level voice. "Ma'am, this property is not governed by the HOA. It is registered under federal advisement status with perimeter monitoring. You are currently trespassing." Jolene's eyebrows shot up so high they practically met her hairline. "That's not possible. This is a residential area. You can't just declare land federal." "I'm not declaring anything," Agent Diaz replied smoothly. "You're welcome to check with the county assessor's office. The parcel number is on file." Jolene stared blankly, then decided that rather than verify anything, she'd go with her strength. Baseless accusations. This is some kind of deep state psyop. I've seen the videos. They said people like me would be targeted. I'm the real victim here. I almost choked on my lemonade trying to hold back a laugh. Jolene wasn't just wrong. She was catastrophically, publicly, and entertainingly wrong. She turned to me as if expecting me to somehow concede defeat. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. I shrugged. "Kind of." At this point, Phil decided to speak. "Maybe we should just de-escalate," he offered in a weak voice. "Let's, maybe wait to hear from the board before doing anything else." Jolene spun around and pointed a finger at him like a furious dictator. "No, we can't back down now. This is our neighborhood. We don't take orders from federal actors pretending to be neighbors." Agent Sanchez tapped his earpiece again and said, "HQ advise. We may need to conduct a misinformation evaluation. Civilian appears to be escalating under paranoid delusions, possibly influenced by conspiracy material." Jolene's jaw dropped so fast it could have dislocated. "Did you just call me paranoid? That's slander. Only if it's not true," I muttered under my breath. Agent Sanchez remained calm. "You are being documented for unlawful interference with a federally monitored property. Continued obstruction will result in detainment." Jolene backed up slightly, but still held firm. "I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting right now," she declared. "And you," she pointed directly at me, "will be removed by vote." This was so wildly incorrect that even Agent Diaz raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, you cannot vote someone off their own federally registered land. That's not how democracy works." Jolene stormed off with Phil in tow, muttering about taking this to the highest levels of HOA law. Phil seemed less committed and more like a man desperately trying not to appear on the evening news. Agent Sanchez turned to me with a dry smirk. You weren't kidding. She's one of the loud ones. She's the loud one, I said. The rest are mostly just confused. The next day, the real circus arrived. Jolene had actually managed to gather a small group of residents in her backyard for an emergency meeting. I only knew because they had set up a folding table with donuts, a loudspeaker, and a stack of poorly printed flyers that read, "Protect our neighborhood from government infiltration." It looked like a cult meeting trying to sell timeshares. I watched from my porch with binoculars and a coffee mug that read, "Federal Problem." Agent Sanchez stood nearby, unfazed as always. Phil tried to mediate, reading from some HOA manual about boundary disputes. But Jolene snatched the paper from him mid-sentence and went on a tirade about sovereign citizen rights and how my shed was a signal disruption site. Things got worse when she brought out a homemade diagram of my property with red arrows pointing to suspicious locations. One arrow literally pointed at a garden hose. Another circled my satellite dish with the words, "Mind Control Beam." Agent Sanchez leaned toward me and asked, "Should we be concerned?" "Only if she builds a catapult," I replied. The climax of the meeting came when Jolene introduced a motion to have me banned from the neighborhood. She stood on a plastic chair and shouted, "All in favor of evicting the intruder, raise your hands." Out of the dozen people in her yard, only 2 raised their hands, both of whom seemed unsure why they were doing it. One of them was mid-bite into a jelly donut and froze in embarrassment. Jolene was undeterred. She declared the vote passed and told Phil to draft an official HOA order. Phil looked at her, then at me, and quietly said, "I think I forgot how to write." It would have been comical if it hadn't been borderline tragic. This woman had poured her energy into a fantasy war against someone who literally owned the land she claimed as hers. And despite the humiliation, the ignored votes, and the presence of actual government agents, she still thought she could win. Agent Sanchez stepped forward, holding a tablet that displayed drone footage. "Ma'am," he said, walking toward the property line again. "This is surveillance footage from last week. You're shown entering this yard 7 times without permission, recording video, and making verbal threats." Jolene blinked, lips twitching. "That's fake. Deep fake. It's all fake." Phil peeked at the footage and muttered, "That looks like your blue visor, Jolene." Jolene's response was to grab her phone and shout, "That's it. I'm calling the media. The real media, not your puppets." Agent Sanchez simply said, "We'll inform them when they arrive." And that was the moment I realized something incredible. Jolene wasn't just angry or mistaken. She was so committed to being right, even in the face of overwhelming truth, that she would take this to the end of the earth, or at least the local news. And that was exactly where things were about to go. By Monday morning, Jolene's front yard had been transformed into what she called a community truth zone. She'd set up a white canopy tent with hand-painted signs declaring things like, "This neighborhood is being watched," and "Protect our rights from fake feds." Under the tent, she had a folding table cluttered with clipboards, highlighters, and stacks of printouts featuring blurry screenshots of my security cameras, my satellite dish, and somehow my mailbox. Each was marked with arrows, labels, and dramatic red underlining. One sign read "Unknown Frequencies," with a stick figure diagram of a man with a briefcase, which I think was supposed to be me. She'd also called the press, and to my disbelief, they actually showed up. A local news van rolled up just after noon, its antenna popping up and camera crew unloading while Jolene dabbed her forehead with a handkerchief like she was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. I watched from my office window, sipping tea and shaking my head. Agent Sanchez stood behind me, arms folded, watching Jolene's circus unfold with the quiet judgment of a man who'd seen everything from international smuggling rings to rooftop hostage negotiations. This, however, might have topped it. Jolene greeted the reporter as if she were royalty, launching into a dramatic retelling of how she bravely confronted a potential infiltrator and how multiple actors disguised as government agents threatened her constitutional rights. The reporter, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be covering a high school bake sale, asked if there was any proof. Jolene pointed across the street at my house and said, "It's all happening right there, right under our noses." Then, in a stunning act of poor judgment, she escorted the reporter toward my fence, waving him forward like she was guiding him through the gates of a secret military base. They walked right up to my property line and started filming, narrating her accusations while pointing at everything from my garden gnome to the motion sensors. At one point, she accused my solar panels of intercepting data from neighborhood Wi-Fi. I could practically hear Agent Sanchez's blood pressure spike. Without saying a word, Agent Sanchez walked outside and approached the group. Calm, respectful, but unmistakably firm, he asked to see press credentials. The cameraman handed them over without argument. Agent Sanchez nodded, then said, "You're welcome to film on public land, but any step past this line," he pointed to the edge of the grass, "is trespassing on federally protected private property. You'll be detained if you proceed." Jolene launched into another tirade, but the reporter took one look at the agent's badges and gently backed away, muttering something about legal liabilities. Jolene was clearly losing control of the narrative, and it only got worse when she realized the crew was packing up. "Don't you want the real story?" she barked. "This is about tyranny." But the reporter wasn't buying it. He'd seen enough. "We'll reach out to the authorities for a balanced follow-up," he said, then made a beeline for the van. Jolene tried to stop him, but he slipped inside, and the antenna dropped before she could finish yelling about 5G rays. Now she was furious. Her stage had crumbled in front of her audience. She stormed back to her tent, grabbed her phone, and started live streaming. "The media has been silenced," she ranted, pacing like a general. "But we are not done. Not until the truth comes out. I will not be intimidated by badges and vehicles and fake agents. We will expose this fraud." She panned her phone toward my house and zoomed in on my porch where Agent Sanchez had returned. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then turned to me. "HQ recommends temporary extraction. Given the visibility and now media escalation, we're activating relocation protocol." I nodded. It wasn't the first time this had happened. When you work with sensitive operations, sometimes you have to step back and let the situation cool down. I didn't mind. The idea of letting Jolene stew in her own madness while I disappeared quietly for a few days felt oddly poetic. I packed a bag and locked up the house. As I got into the SUV, I turned to Agent Sanchez. "You sure she won't jump the fence while we're gone?" He gave a slight smirk. "Actually, we're installing temporary barriers, surveillance alerts, and a few surprises." "Surprises?" "You'll see," he said. We left without fanfare. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just two SUVs gliding out of the neighborhood. Jolene came running out of her tent, trying to film the departure, screaming about how they were fleeing before the real investigation began. She waved her phone wildly like she'd just broken Watergate. The moment I was gone, Agent Sanchez's team moved fast. A new perimeter sign went up at my fence. It read, "Federal Surveillance Zone. Entry restricted under Title 18 U.S.C. Section 1382. Jolene stared at it, puzzled but intrigued. Then a crew installed a small camera tower, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. They weren't playing anymore. Jolene, of course, didn't take this as a warning. She took it as a challenge. The very next morning, she crept across the street in a robe, phone in hand, narrating her walk toward what she now called the forbidden fence. She crouched low like she was evading snipers. Then she did it. She reached over the fence, touched the camera pole, and said, "See? They can't stop us. This is still America." What she didn't know was that her every move was being live-streamed back to a secure server. The moment she breached the boundary, a silent alarm triggered. Within 20 minutes, a federal response vehicle arrived. Jolene was still pacing in her yard, ranting into her phone, when the officers approached. She barely got a word out before they placed her under arrest for trespassing on a federally protected property. The neighborhood watched in silence as she was read her rights and placed into the back of the cruiser. Her phone clattered to the sidewalk. The camera was still rolling. Phil came out of his house just in time to see her being driven away. He rubbed his eyes like he couldn't believe it had gone this far. He looked across the street at the empty driveway where my SUV used to sit and muttered, "This is why I don't do committees." The fallout was instant. Screenshots of her arrest video hit local social media. Someone added music to the footage. Bad Boys was the obvious choice. By noon, it was trending under hashtags like Jolene versus the Feds and Backyard Battles. Her tent was taken down by 2 HOA volunteers who clearly wanted no part in her crusade anymore. Back at the safe house, I was watching the whole thing on a tablet while sipping coffee. Agent Sanchez handed me a plate of eggs and said, "She finally crossed the line. You were right." "About what?" "That she wouldn't quit until she got herself arrested." I smiled. And this is just the halfway point. Jolene's arrest video spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By Tuesday morning, nearly every resident had seen it. Someone had even projected it onto their garage door during an evening barbecue, complete with commentary and popcorn. No one openly laughed during the playback, but the smirks, the cough-suppressed chuckles, and the occasional "play it again" requests made it clear. The tide had turned. Jolene, once the self-proclaimed guardian of HOA purity, had become the neighborhood punchline. Her grand cause had ended with her in handcuffs and her live stream abruptly cutting off with the sound of a car door slamming shut. At first, a few of her loyalists tried to spin it. One neighbor, Mrs. Langley, posted on the community board that Jolene had been abducted by rogue agents for asking too many questions. But when the official police report dropped, detailing her federal trespass violation and the footage showing her clearly crossing the marked line, even the conspiracy diehards started backing off. Phil, perhaps realizing the HOA was now in deep water, quietly stepped down from his self-given role as neighborhood watch commander and returned to quietly power washing his driveway in peace. In a twist no one expected, the very next day brought something even more surreal: an FBI-sponsored cookout. It wasn't a full-blown agency event, but Agent Sanchez and his team, trying to ease tensions and perhaps salvage the relationship between the federal presence and the civilian neighbors, decided to host a small appreciation event. They set up a modest barbecue grill in my backyard, now nicknamed Area 52 by the neighbors, and invited everyone on the block. At first, people arrived cautiously, unsure if it was some kind of sting or surveillance trap. But once they realized the food was real, the drinks were cold, and the agents weren't in the mood to interrogate anyone, the atmosphere shifted. Agent Diaz stood at the grill, flipping burgers with surgical precision. Agent Sanchez handled drinks, handing out sodas and water like a bartender in a no-nonsense lounge. Kids played on the grass. Adults mingled. People brought side dishes. One family even brought lawn chairs and sat in the shade, chatting with my detail like they were old friends. Nobody asked intrusive questions, they just hung out. It was the most peaceful the neighborhood had felt in months. From her house, Jolene watched everything unfold with curtains barely parted. She was out on bail, obviously under strict restrictions, but she hadn't spoken to anyone. Her lawn had gone untrimmed. Her usual front yard presence had vanished. Some said she was planning a comeback. Others said she was consulting a lawyer. But in that moment, she was just a ghost behind a window, watching the community gather without her. Agent Sanchez approached me with a paper plate stacked high with ribs and coleslaw. "Didn't think your first backyard party post-conflict would include 3 agents and a cooler full of sparkling water," he said dryly. "I like the low-key vibe," I replied. "And nobody's filming anyone." "Well," he added, "except for the drone." Sure enough, a small surveillance drone buzzed overhead, doing a slow circle of the yard. Not for intimidation, just protocol. Still, it made for a strange juxtaposition. Kids with balloons on one side and government optics floating over the potato salad on the other. Welcome to Suburbia 2.0. But the peace wasn't meant to last. As if on cue, a second vehicle rolled into the neighborhood. This one didn't have tinted windows or diplomatic plates. It was a plain white van, unmarked, except for a small government seal on the door. The agents paused. Agent Sanchez checked his tablet, then looked at me. "This isn't us." The van pulled into Jolene's driveway. 2 plainclothes individuals stepped out, one carrying a case, the other a thick binder. They rang her doorbell. After a minute, the door creaked open. Jolene appeared, clearly startled. The agents introduced themselves, and within moments, she was visibly agitated again. She stepped outside, waving her arms. The agents stood firm. Then one handed her a document. She snatched it, glanced over it, and went pale. Not angry, not loud, just pale. "What's going on?" I asked Agent Sanchez. He checked his feed, then nodded slowly. "Oh, that's not us. That's financial crimes. IRS, maybe. Looks like she's being served." "Served for what?" "Misappropriation of HOA funds. Embezzlement investigation." I nearly dropped my fork. After all this time, all the accusations she hurled, all the fake laws she quoted, Jolene had been robbing her own HOA. The very organization she claimed to protect had been her personal piggy bank. Rumors started spreading within minutes. She'd used HOA fees to pay for landscaping upgrades on her own property, bought herself a second hot tub under the category of community hydrotherapy, and even claimed a tax write-off for emergency defense signage, which, as it turned out, included the tent and her hand-painted propaganda. The community board wasted no time. By sundown, a vote had been held, an emergency session, this time with quorum, and Jolene was officially removed from any and all HOA positions. Phil abstained from voting, probably because he was still trying to figure out what embezzlement meant, but the rest of the block was unanimous. I watched it all from my porch, plate in hand, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops. A calm golden hour fell over the neighborhood, broken only by the sound of the IRS agents knocking on Jolene's door one final time to collect signatures. She opened the door and stared at the neighborhood one last time. This time, nobody was watching her with admiration. No phones, no allies, just silence. Then the door shut again. Agent Sanchez joined me with a nod. You know, I thought I'd seen some weird assignments in my time, but this one, Jolene might be the strangest threat we've ever had to document. She's not a threat, I said. She's a case study. He laughed. We should publish a paper. The next day, the signs on her lawn were gone. No more conspiracy boards. No more red arrows. The tent had collapsed. The HOA finally approved a petition to have her fence replaced with a lower, see-through one for visibility and safety. Her property looked emptier than ever before. And as we packed up the last of the barbecue leftovers, someone placed a little sign on my fence. It was small, wooden, and hand-carved. It simply read, Jolene Free Zone. No one admitted to making it, but everyone smiled when they walked by. The neighborhood was healing slowly, awkwardly, but it was healing, and I had a front-row seat to it all. The morning Jolene moved out, the neighborhood was quieter than usual, almost reverent. No kids were biking on the sidewalk, no leaf blowers buzzed, and even the birds seemed to chirp at a lower volume. It wasn't that anyone felt sorry for her. She'd burned every bridge and detonated the ashes. But there was a sense of closure in the air, like the final chapter of a long, ridiculous book had been read, and the cover was now being shut for good. A single moving truck sat in her driveway, engine running, while two men loaded her belongings in mechanical silence. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't yell or glare. She didn't even look up. Dressed in a plain sweatshirt and oversized sunglasses, Jolene simply sat on her porch steps with a large tote bag at her feet and a clipboard clutched to her chest, as if still trying to cling to some version of authority. From my porch, I sipped coffee and watched without comment. Agent Sanchez stood beside me, arms folded, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't gloating, he never gloated. But the end of the Jolene saga had brought a distinct lightness to the neighborhood, one he and his team had earned. When the last box was loaded and the door of the truck slammed shut, Jolene stood, took one final look at the street, then got into the passenger seat. The truck pulled away slowly, leaving behind only a patch of dead grass and a sun-faded HOA Proud sticker peeling off her mailbox. No one waved. Within hours, the neighborhood board, newly formed after the HOA's emergency re-election, sent out a welcome letter. It included an apology, not just to me, but to every resident who had been affected by Jolene's fabricated rules, her bullying emails, and her fantasy enforcement team. They promised transparency, accountability, and no more neighborhood patrols led by unqualified volunteers. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. They even invited me to join the board as a consultant, joking that my experience with federal de-escalation might be useful in heated meetings. I respectfully declined. I'd had enough HOA drama to last a lifetime. As a final act of symbolic closure, the board hosted a small unveiling in my backyard, a surprise they had put together with the help of Agent Sanchez's team. It was a smooth stone bench placed under the same tree where I'd first been told to leave my own yard. Etched into the surface was a single phrase, "He stayed." Below it, in tiny lettering, someone had added, "Property owner since 2010. Everyone laughed when they saw it, including Agent Sanchez, who said it was the best taxpayer-funded bench he'd ever sat on. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. Kids returned to the sidewalks. Weekend cookouts came back. People started waving again. The tension that had lingered in the air like fog for months slowly dissolved. And with it, the strange legacy of Jolene's self-appointed reign began to fade, but not entirely. A few reminders remained, like the fence post she'd carved her initials into, or the path in the grass where her HOA enforcement routes had been marched over and over again. One of the most noticeable changes came in the form of the new family that moved into Jolene's old house. The Parkers were a retired couple who immediately introduced themselves to everyone, passed out baked goods, and asked permission before hanging string lights on their porch. Within 2 weeks, they joined the community garden project and hosted a chili cook-off. During their welcome dinner, Mr. Parker raised a toast and said, "We heard about the last tenant. We promise we only enforce bingo rules." It got a standing ovation. Meanwhile, I returned to my usual schedule. I traveled less, worked more from home. The agents rotated as needed, though the presence was scaled back to just 2 now, usually Agent Sanchez and Agent Diaz. We installed additional security features, discreet but effective, just in case another self-appointed lawmaker decided to challenge reality again. Agent Sanchez occasionally brought donuts, now on a first-name basis with most of the block. I caught him once playing catch with the neighbor's dog, his sunglasses tucked into his shirt, laughing freely for the first time since his arrival. About a month later, something strange happened. I was walking out to grab the mail when I spotted a teenager from 3 houses down fiddling with what looked like a string of rope along his fence. Curious, I asked what he was up to. He grinned and said, "Trying to stop squirrels. Don't want him chewing wires." I nodded, and as I turned to walk away, I heard him whisper to a friend, "That's the guy? The one who had the Secret Service and everything." They both stared at me with a mix of awe and fear, as if I might summon a chopper with a snap of my fingers. I didn't say anything, just smiled and went back inside. The legend of Jolene had faded, but apparently, the legend of the man she tried to evict had just begun. A few weeks later, the neighborhood organized a block party. This one had a DJ, a bounce house, even a taco truck. It was easily the biggest event we'd ever hosted. I walked through the crowd, waving to people, laughing with neighbors I barely used to talk to. And then I saw it. Someone had made t-shirts that read Federal Yard Crew, with a cartoon version of me holding a lemonade and 3 suited agents behind me. Another shirt read Jolene Free Zone, with a red circle and slash over a shrieking cartoon lady. Agent Sanchez got one in every color. As the sun set and string lights flickered across the street, I took one final look at the house across from mine. Quiet. Phil, the neighbor, was inside, probably watching a documentary or preparing another batch of muffins with his wife. The chaos had passed. Peace had returned. But just to be sure, I installed one last motion sensor by the fence. Not because I expected trouble, just because I learned that sometimes the wildest problems wear pastel tracksuits and carry clipboards. And if one ever showed up again, well, I had the agents on speed dial and a neighborhood full of witnesses. And more importantly, I had never left my yard. Not once. Not even when told to. Not even when she called me an intruder. Because the truth had always been simple. This was my home. And no matter how loud Jolene screamed, how many rules she invented, or how many imaginary patrols she threatened to summon, I wasn't going anywhere. Some battles don't need fists or fury, just patience, truth, and a lawn chair in your rightful place.